The Senate emergency session began under dim amber bands that circled the chamber like warning lights. Officially, they were procedural markers for trade adjudication. Hayes had sat through enough emergency dockets to know what they signaled in practice. A creditor, war dressed as law. Ambassador Elena Hayes stood at the human dais in a dark formal coat, hands folded behind her back, while 3 tiers above, Krelix delegates streamed market overlays into the air as if the vote were already complete. The Krelix did not posture like soldiers. They performed certainty like accountants who had purchased gravity. Their lead delegation wore mirrored membranes over their eyes and black gold ledger rigs along their forearms, each rig projecting debt trees that branched through hundreds of systems. Hayes had watched senators admire those displays before as signs of sophistication. Today, from where she stood, they looked like killboards with softer language. Across the chamber, Speaker Iller of the Valari requested clarification on jurisdictional limits over sovereign shipping lanes, and High Commander Blake answered before the Senate clerk could recognize him. His voice carried with practiced ease, warm in tone and cold in content. Clarification is unnecessary. The League has merely offered your youngest member what every emerging culture requires: structure, liquidity, and disciplined oversight. Humanity is energetic but economically adolescent, prone to emotional policy and uneconomic loyalty. We propose to absorb that volatility. In return, humans receive stabilized routes, guaranteed arbitration, and managed access to mineral futures they are currently too fragmented to exploit. You call this coercion because you fear efficiency. We call it adulthood. The chamber answered with a silence Hayes had learned to distrust. Less agreement than risk calculation. Blake continued and used the pause like granted time. Let us retire the sentimental theater. Humans are uplifted tool users with unusual persistence and admirable tolerance for scarcity. Useful traits, not governing traits. Their colonies overextend. Their insurers are young. Their legal standards provincial. If they accept League stewardship now, they survive market weather. If they decline, they will learn what every species learns. Credit is the first language of power, and debt is merely accountability measured over time. Hayes watched minor delegations shift in their seats, especially those from border polities already tied to Krelix shipping credit. Delegates exchanged glances, opened private channels, then shut them again when aides angled datapads toward them with fresh lean notices. The Krelix had not simply arrived with terms. As Hayes read the room, they had arrived having already purchased procedural momentum. A vote map flickered above the central floor. Above, worlds that had promised neutrality during pre-session talks were now flagged as contingent with debt exposure warnings attached. 2 had already switched to procedural abstention, which in Senate arithmetic functioned as support for the stronger party. The political architecture still looked intact. Hayes could see, line by line, which load-bearing beams had been quietly bought. Blake requested full speaking privilege and received it over scattered objections. He expanded his proposal into binding language: exclusive Krelix rights over human arterial lanes for 25 years, League-controlled arbitration panels seated in Krelix exchanges, mandatory inspection authority over all flagged human freight, and collateralization of future colonial mineral output against transit stabilization costs. Hayes listened to the clauses stack and heard the craftsmanship in them. The contract was elegant in the same way a snare was elegant. When the first protest came from the scholars of Lum, it arrived as legal concern rather than accusation. Their chair noted that bonded repayment clauses appeared to extend beyond signatory governments to successor populations. Blake smiled without showing teeth. You use old moral vocabulary for modern trade. Bondage implies force. This is choice. If a world signs for security and later regrets discipline, that is not victimhood. It is arithmetic. The Valari delegation pushed harder, demanding explicit limits against seizure fleets in Senate space. Blake turned his head toward them with theatrical patience. The League enforces lawful reclamation when debtors conceal assets or default under false distress declarations. Any species that is solvent has nothing to fear. Any species that objects may, of course, post guarantees on behalf of human obligations. We welcome philanthropy. No one posted guarantees. From the human dais, Hayes could see why in real time. AIDS feeding delegates revised risk sheets, credit band repricing models, projected penalties at Krelix-controlled junctions. It was not a military blockade. It was cleaner than that. Food routes slowed, medicine futures spiked, insurers withdrew coverage, and every cut could be explained as ordinary risk management. By the second hour of debate, 6 smaller species had received synchronized margin calls tied to regional instability associated with human noncompliance. Hayes saw the alerts bloom on shared procedural feeds. No one threatened them in words. Their numbers were threatened in real time. From the observer's balcony, Rear Admiral Marcus Sullivan sat in civilian black with no insignia visible, receiving silent updates through a wrist implant. He watched Blake with the fixed attention he normally gave propulsion, telemetry, and weapons readiness reports. Beside him, Intelligence Director Anna Petrov tapped 2 fingers against her datapad each time another Senate node reported a vote drift connected to newly activated shell funds. Her expression did not change. He is using layered proxies faster than committee council can map beneficial ownership, Petrov murmured. Sullivan kept his eyes on Blake. Can we prove lineage? We can prove patterns now. Lineage later. 47 fronts at least. Possibly more. Arbitration kernels are being fed pre-biased case law from private archives. Logged? Every packet. Sullivan gave one small nod. Then we keep logging. On the floor, Hayes finally requested response time. Her words were brief, neutral, and devastatingly restrained. Humanity recognizes the League's right to lawful commerce and the Senate's right to regulate transit. We do not recognize coercive contracts attached to manipulated debt instruments, extra-sovereign inspection rights, or private military seizure authority in common space. We ask the clerk to mark these provisions as contested pending independent audit. Blake laughed openly, a low metallic trill amplified by chamber acoustics. Ambassador Hayes, your species mistakes procedural delay for leverage. You do not have leverage. You have sentiment, a young fleet, and colonies built on borrowed machinery. Sign now and retain dignity. Refuse and we will collect under statute. You may call it insult if that comforts you. Markets do not blush. He turned to the chamber and widened the blade. I move immediate provisional enforcement. Double tolls on all human-flagged lanes until compliance signatures are recorded. Authorize asset reclamation against any human vessel declining League inspection at designated checkpoints. Freeze appeals through standard channels due to emergency liquidity risk. 3 delegations objected at once. Hayes tracked the objection queue as it reordered itself. 2 protests vanished within minutes after aides received fresh notices of lean acceleration. The third, the Valari, held their objection on record and accepted the financial penalty without visible reaction. Hayes registered the gesture with a single incline of her head. At the back of the human section, Captain Sophia Novak stood with mission operations staff, uniform plain and unadorned except for relief convoy command bars. She had spent the previous year escorting medical shipments through piracy corridors and had learned to identify predation by vocabulary before gunfire. Inspection authority meant boarding teams. Reclamation meant confiscation. Liquidity event meant someone's children skipped meals on a station because numbers had been weaponized upstream. A junior officer beside her whispered, "Do they think we will sign this?" Novak answered without looking away from the floor. "They think we will prioritize continuity over sovereignty." "Will we?" Her mouth tightened into something almost amused. "Ask me again after legal tells us what they can freeze and fleet tells us what they can defend." In a secured conference room, 2 corridors from the chamber, the rest of the human team assembled as votes were still being bought in plain sight. Hayes entered first, followed by Sullivan, Petrov, Chief Jurist Thomas Fletcher, Logistics Coordinator Ingrid Larson, and 2 Senate liaisons linked to Allied delegations. She read the room in a glance, anger contained, fatigue suppressed, no appetite for theatrics. No one wasted time on outrage. Outrage was expensive and produced no deliverables. Fletcher projected a lattice of Krellick's corporate entities across the wall. Their legal strategy is old and brutal. They separate liability from enforcement through nested charters, then hide command responsibility in algorithmic arbitration. If we challenge one node, they liquidate to another jurisdiction before judgment enters. Petrov expanded the map and highlighted red chains reaching back nearly 2 centuries. They are not just exploiting humans. They have done this to 6 polities, maybe more. Slow capture through contract terms that looked normal until stress events hit. They prefer lawful language because it lowers resistance. Larson pulled up convoy schedules. If tolls double and inspection delays stand, 18 frontier worlds hit ration thresholds in 21 days. Hospital platforms at Ilex and Damar lose sterile supplies first. After that, reactor maintenance parts. Sullivan leaned forward, hands on the table. Assume they enforce. Assume they seize one convoy as demonstration. What is our response ladder? Hayes answered before anyone else. Publicly, legal contest. Privately, full spectrum preparation. We will not be rushed into their narrative, but we will not confuse restraint with passivity. Fletcher looked to her. If we move on legal warfare, we need synchronized filing across at least 9 jurisdictions, plus forensic releases timed to market open. It has to be machine speed, or they will outrun us. Build it, Hayes said. Petrov added, we can expose bribed arbitration kernels, forged liens, shell flows. Not all at once, sequenced for maximum freeze. Larson said, on logistics, we can reflag civilian freighters as relief auxiliaries and route through debris lanes the League does not ensure. It is slower, but it keeps food moving. Sullivan finally looked at Novak. If they board medical traffic. Novak met his gaze. Then, we record the seizure, issue one lawful demand for release, and disable their ability to repeat it precisely. No panic fire, no life support kills, bridges intact for trial. For the first time that day, Hayes saw a thin line of approval cross Sullivan's face. Good. Discipline is the message. Hayes closed the room with a directive that carried the weight of oath rather than rhetoric. They built this strategy on a forecast. Youngest species, thin reserves, short memory, high shame tolerance. They are wrong on each variable. We proceed through law first because law matters. If they force escalation, we respond proportionally and transparently. Document everything. Protect transit. Protect civilians. Keep allies fed. If we must break their enforcement arm, we do it where the whole Senate can see exactly why. Outside, the chamber lights shifted to recess mode, while clerks prepared emergency vote packets and brokers prepared fresh offers. Hayes watched status ribbons populate across her pad, files moving, convoys rerouting. quiet instructions passing from embassy corridors to fleet relays with almost no wasted words. The Krelliks believed they had isolated humanity on paper. Looking at the incoming evidence chains, Hayes saw the opposite taking shape: a common ledger of proof. The common ledger of proof was still populating when the chamber doors reopened and Speaker Ilir called emergency session back to order. Recess had lasted 23 minutes, enough time for 3 neutral delegations to receive revised debt terms, and enough time for Krelliks market custodians to circulate a draft enforcement circular before debate had even resumed. Hayes returned to the human dais, shoulders square, and watched the circular appear on public feeds as if it were a clerical update. It was not clerical. It was a test strike wrapped in procedural language. High Commander Blake requested immediate floor recognition and did not wait for full grant before speaking. His mirrored ocular membranes reflected the chamber lights in hard bands, and his ledger rig projected shipping maps with human lanes highlighted in red. Under emergency liquidity statutes and with provisional support from signatory creditors, the League now designates all human flagged convoy traffic as enhanced risk inventory. Effective immediately, designated customs frigates may inspect, quarantine, and temporarily transfer cargo under reclamation supervision. This is a stabilizing measure. Compliance confirms solvency. Refusal confirms concealment. A murmur moved through the upper tiers. The word temporarily changed nothing. Everyone in the chamber understood that cargo transferred into Krelliks reclamation channels rarely came back before spoilage, insolvency, or political surrender rendered return irrelevant. Hayes requested speaking privilege, and when it came, she spoke without heat, each clause precise enough for court record. Humanity enters formal notice. The proposed enforcement circular violates Senate transit covenants, sovereignty protections, and standing restrictions on private military seizure in common lanes. We demand immediate withdrawal of all League seizure fleets from Senate space, release of bonded client worlds held under coercive debt structures, and voiding of transit contracts executed under manipulated credit pressure. You have 72 hours. She paused once, long enough for the clerk to finish transcription, then added the line she had reserved for the moment when ambiguity ended. For 30 years, we accepted insult to preserve peace. Do not mistake patience for incapacity. Blake laughed again, lower this time, as if amused by a junior advocate who had misunderstood leverage. Ambassador Hayes, your warning is ceremonial theater from a species still learning interstellar adulthood. 72 hours is generous by frontier standards. You will have 12 to acknowledge compliance before toll multipliers activate. Furthermore, by authority granted to League enforcement assets, I am extending asset reclamation to any human vessel that declines inspection, including relief platforms carrying undeclared strategic goods under medical exemption. The chamber reacted more sharply to that final clause than to his insults. Even delegations already financially trapped by Krelliks credit understood what it meant to criminalize hospital exemptions. Speaker Ilir struck the gavel twice and demanded legal justification. Blake produced preloaded arbitration opinions from 3 private exchanges and transmitted them directly to the central docket. Chief Jurist Fletcher, standing behind the human dais, scanned the packet and leaned toward Hayes without taking his eyes from the data stream. Forgery signatures match the colonels Petrov flagged. Not subtle. They expect speed to stand in for legitimacy. Across the aisle, a representative from the Scholars of Lum rose on procedural challenge. Before the clerk could cue the objection, his aides received a fresh lean acceleration notice on visible side screens. He sat down slowly and said nothing further. The insult was no longer rhetorical, it was operational. By late cycle, while debates still churned in formal language, Krelix enforcement relays pushed inspection beacons into the ILEX Hyperlane Junction and 2 feeder routes near Damar. On the human operations line, Captain Novak watched the beacons appear one by one, each coded as lawful temporary infrastructure, each escorted by frigates with boarding modules hot. A junior tactical analyst at her shoulder said, "They deployed before the vote closed." Novak answered, "Because they are not waiting for legality. They are manufacturing habit." Rear Admiral Sullivan joined her at the side console with Petrov and Larson on split-channel projection. Sullivan read the deployment map once and spoke into Secure Command. "Fleet Command to all humanitarian convoy escorts. Continue transit profiles. Do not initiate fire. Full sensor recording, multi-channel. Any boarding attempt receives 1 warning under Senate Covenant language. Repeat 1 warning only." Petrov overlaid financial telemetry. "We have parallel movement. 40% of League liquidity now touches entities we can freeze if we publish chain evidence in synchronized jurisdictions. We are ready within 6 hours." Hayes stayed connected from the chamber floor, voice steady in everyone's earpiece despite the noise behind her. "Proceed with legal strike package at market open. Sequence 1, forged arbitration kernels. Sequence 2, shell corporations tied to seizure fleets. Sequence 3, beneficial owners in this chamber. No leaks, no theatrics." Larson switched to logistics routing with the velocity of someone moving triage under fire. Relief cargo split into smaller manifests and distributed to auxiliary freighters. Debris lane reroutes initiated. Valeri escorts confirmed for 2 food corridors if we guarantee hull insurance. Sullivan said, "Guarantee it." The Valeri guarantee arrived 3 minutes later with no commentary, just signatures and route commitments. Hayes read the file and allowed herself 1 controlled breath. The gesture from Ilir's government was expensive and dangerous, and it meant they had chosen record over fear. Blake chose escalation before the hour closed. He opened a chamber-wide channel and declared that the first non-compliant human convoy at ILEX would be detained as a demonstration of lawful reclamation. He used the phrase lawful 3 times and the phrase civilized markets twice. Hayes requested last response and received it over his objection. "Let the record reflect this clearly. You have been given lawful demands and a window to comply. If you seize protected relief traffic, you will trigger direct defensive action under Senate Covenant, and every packet of evidence tied to your system will be published in every jurisdiction we can reach. This is not a ritual of offended pride. It is notice." Blake tilted his head in something like pity. "Then defend your sentiment with your adolescent fleet." The channel cut. Chamber lights dimmed to adjournment status. No one mistook it for peace. In the human command room, silence held for 2 heartbeats after the door sealed. Then Sullivan spoke, and the room shifted from diplomatic tempo to warfighting tempo with no wasted movement. They crossed medical exemption and declared seizure in common space. Response authority is active. Rules remain strict. We disable capacity, not life support. We preserve bridges and command cores for prosecution. Every shot logged. Novak stood at the tactical table, eyes on the ILEX route, where Hospital Convoy Meridian had just entered approach vectors with 2 destroyer escorts and 1 Corvette screen. "My ships are in range within 11 minutes. If they board, we warn once, then remove boarding capability and propulsion. If they fire, we remove fire control." Hayes looked around the table at each face in turn. "We are not meeting them on their terms. Law first, force second, both transparent. The objective is protection and proof. No revenge decisions, no improvisational anger." Petrov closed her datapad and met Sullivan's gaze. The freeze package launches at next trading bell. They will feel it while this is happening. Sullivan nodded. Then, we start both fronts together. 3 hours after adjournment, High Commander Blake stood on the command balcony of the Krellix enforcement carrier Ledger of Dawn at Ilex and watched human convoy transponders approach the junction like obedient entries on an audit strip. From his perspective, the battle had already been won in committee rooms and insurance offices. Ships were only the visible punctuation. He had broken older powers with the same sequence, and younger ones usually broke faster because they still believed legitimacy could survive isolation. His operations chief, Executor Varesh, projected comparative compliance curves from 6 historical campaigns. Human behavior tracks pre-collapse signatures from the JAL Compact, Varesh said. Initial legal protest, symbolic escort deployment, then concession when food volatility appears on frontier nodes. Expected timeline to contract signature, 11 to 17 days. Blake folded his upper hands behind his back and watched the tactical overlays. Human escorts were lighter than Krellix Customs frigates and carried fewer broadside emitters. Their formation was defensive, conservative, almost polite. Transmit inspection demand, Blake said. Use full covenant language. Offer voluntary compliance path. Archive all refusals for liability proceedings. At the junction itself, Krellix frigates bracketed the Meridian convoy and launched boarding tugs with magnetic claws folded against their hulls. The convoy-led transmitted medical exemption certificates and Senate corridor permits. Krellix Traffic Control rejected both as pending review and ordered engines to idle for transfer. Captain Novak listened from the destroyer HRS Kepler while her tactical officer counted distances in clipped numbers. She keyed open-channel broadcast on Senate frequencies, League frequencies, and emergency civilian bands. This is Captain Sophia Novak, Human Relief Escort Command. You are attempting unlawful seizure of protected medical traffic in common Senate space. Stand down and clear the corridor immediately. This is your single warning under Covenant statute. The Krellix reply came from a customs adjudicator with perfect courtroom diction. Human escort. You are obstructing lawful reclamation under emergency market authority. Power down weapons and submit to inspection. Non-compliance authorizes proportional correction. Novak waited the required 5 seconds for legal timestamp synchronization. Warning acknowledged as refused. Recording active. Engage Plan Sentinel. On Blake's balcony, Varesh frowned as his tactical feed flickered, with new icons blooming inside the debris halo that ringed the junction. Unregistered contacts, Varesh said. Small signatures, possibly drones launched from civilian hulls. Blake's tone stayed contemptuous. Decoys. Proceed boarding. The first human rail strike hit a boarding tug's drive ring and spun it harmlessly away from the convoy. 2 more strikes cut grappler assemblies from the second tug without breaching crew compartments. Kepler and her sister destroyer did not target bridges, life support trunks, or reactor cores. They targeted only seizure tools, engine manifolds, and weapons mounts pointed at civilian hulls. Krellix frigates answered with broad suppression fire and discovered their fire control lagging by half a second, then 1 full second, then dropping target lock entirely as human cyber teams injected false range ghosts through maintenance channels embedded months earlier in commercially licensed navigation software. The tactic was not dramatic. It was humiliating. Varesh stared at the collapse in certainty with visible disbelief. Their packets are inside our gunnery loop. Purge and reboot, Blake snapped. Already cycling. They are re-entering on restart. At the same moment, across Senate financial nets, Petrov's freeze package detonated in legal space. Shell corporations linked to League seizure fleets locked under emergency injunctions in 9 jurisdictions. Credit lines evaporated between one market tick and the next. Insurance engines flagged Krellix combat hulls as uninsurable pending fraud review. On Blake's side screens, liquidity indicators went from green to warning amber so quickly the color shift looked like a system's fault. It was not a fault. It was design. At Ilex, human corvettes emerged from the debris lanes with modular pods attached where cargo containers should have been. The pods unfolded into drone clouds that seeded non-lethal dazzlers across Krellick's sensor apertures and burned through shield emitters with precision pulses calibrated to avoid core cascade. A League frigate tried to pivot for ramming position and lost thrust when a kinetic lance from Kepler sheared its port drive vanes. The ship drifted, intact but finished. On the Meridian convoy, medical crews continued triage under vibration alarms, while human escort marines stood by airlocks that never needed to open. Novak kept her voice level through the engagement timer. Target list Delta. Disable remaining impound hulls. Preserve command bridges. Record all surrender pings. One by one, Krellick's captains transmitted distress and legal protest in the same burst packets, as if argument could reverse trajectory. Human ships accepted surrender codes and ceased fire exactly as doctrine required. 6 minutes after first shot, every Krellick's impound vessel at Ilex was dead in space or venting maneuver gas without weapons authority. No habitats were breached. No civilian life support failed. Every hostile bridge remained pressurized and visible on record. On Ledger of Dawn, Blake watched the junction map settle into an outcome his doctrine had not budgeted for. Human escorts, still in disciplined formation, were broadcasting full engagement logs to Senate archive nodes in real time. They had not lashed out. They had executed. Faresh spoke carefully, each word stripped of earlier certainty. High Commander, recommendations from legal are to classify this as an isolated tactical anomaly and proceed with broader punitive deployment. Recommendations from finance are to suspend reclamation activity until liquidity stabilizes. Blake turned from the glass and issued the order that committed him past recovery. No suspension. Escalate to punitive fleet action. If they want precedent, we will give them one. At Human Fleet Relay, Sullivan heard the same intercept 30 seconds later and looked to Hayes on secure channel. Between them passed the quiet understanding that the line had now been crossed in both law and force. Hayes answered first. Publish sequence 2. Sullivan turned to Novak's live feed, where disabled Krellick's frigates drifted around an untouched hospital convoy and surrender signals pulsed against the dark. Captain, secure the corridor and recover survivors from any compromised hulls, including theirs. Novak acknowledged. Understood. Corridor secure. Rescue operations beginning. Then, Sullivan gave the order the team had prepared from the moment Blake mistook patience for weakness. Fleet-wide. Condition Argent. We respond. The acknowledgement cascade came back from human hulls in less than 2 seconds, each return packet tagged with rules of engagement, jurisdictional authorities, and medical corridor priorities before weapons states. To anyone raised on Krellick's doctrine, it would have looked backward. To Sullivan, it was the point. Firepower without legal framing won battles and lost systems. Firepower with admissible evidence ended empires. In the command well beneath Senate Annex 3, Intelligence Director Anna Petrov pushed her chair back from the tactical wall and stood between two projections that never appeared together in older wars. One map of ship vectors, one map of courts. Chief Jurist Thomas Fletcher moved to her left, already dictating filing language as assistants routed certified evidence to 9 jurisdictions, then 12, then 16 when Allied clerks volunteered emergency dockets. The legal strike package was no longer a set of petitions. It was a synchronized offensive. Sequence 2 is armed, Petrov said, voice level. Shell corporations tied to active seizure fleets. We are not alleging association. We are proving command custody, beneficial ownership, and fraud recursion. Fletcher did not look up. Release in chained order. If they liquidate Node 1, Node 2 triggers injunction by inheritor liability. If they dump Node 2, Node 3 triggers criminal asset hold for flight pattern. Keep every branch hostile to motion. Hayes watched from a secure wall feed as the first Krelix exchange tried the move that had saved them for 2 centuries. Rapid dissolution into pre-cleared successor entities. Human forensic models had anticipated it. The successor papers were already in the evidence bundle, signed 6 years earlier by officers currently sitting in League war rooms. Automated clerks in 3 neutral systems flagged those officers as active military command and froze the transfers mid-execution. 19 minutes after Sullivan declared condition argent, 40% of League liquid credit was no longer spendable without judicial override. The chamber did not erupt. It tightened. Delegates who had spent years pretending Krelix accounting was too complex to interrogate now watched bright denial markers spread across public finance boards like firebreak lines. A debt broker from the Merchants of Pax opened a protest channel, read the first page of the warrant set, and closed it without speaking. At Ilex, Novak supervised rescue tugs while her operations display split to include finance telemetry. A medical officer glanced from drifting frigates to the numbers and swore softly in disbelief. "Captain, we hit their ships and their money at the same time." Novak tracked a damaged Krelix lifeboat drifting toward Meridian's shield envelope and vectored a recovery drone toward it. "We hit their pattern," she said. "Ships and money are just where the pattern lives." On the Krelix carrier Ledger of Dawn, Executor Varesh received 12 denial alerts in less than a minute, then watched his emergency procurement authority lock out across 3 exchanges that had never rejected League commands in living memory. He attempted to route through proxy insurers and found each proxy tagged by the same forensic stamp: manipulated arbitration lineage, pending fraud adjudication, collateral seizure suspended. He turned toward Blake with the controlled posture of a subordinate carrying catastrophic news. "Hi, Commander. Punitive deployment is encountering transactional friction. Fuel guarantees for second-line carriers are denied until audit release. Munitions hedges are suspended. Port sureties have requested independent bond verification." Blake's upper hands flexed once, a small motion that on his species read as pure hostility. "Then seize what is needed." Varesh held the silence for 1 beat too long. Authority to seize under reclamation depends on the same arbitration kernels now under injunction. If we proceed anyway, several neutral ports have signaled they will classify League vessels as uninsured aggressors and deny dock access. Blake's laugh returned, but it had narrowed into something sharp. Neutral ports threatened doctrine because frightened primates filed paperwork quickly. "Not quickly," Varesh said, and regretted his honesty immediately. "Preparedly." The words sat in the air between them like a fracture line. Across Senate space, smaller species that had lived for decades inside the Krelix shadow began reading public exhibits that had never reached them before. Petrov's team released contracts side by side with internal League correspondence, each coercive clause pinned to private messages discussing famine leverage, election timing, and shipment throttling as political tools. The archive was not rhetorical, it was itemized. Speaker Ilir requested emergency speaking privilege not as chair, but as representative of the Velarii. When granted, they addressed the chamber in the clipped ceremonial register reserved for declarations of interstate risk. For 12 cycles, we accepted the premise that our dependence was natural and our fear prudent. The human filing demonstrates our dependence was manufactured and our fear monetized. The Velarii Compact recognizes all injunctions, offers temporary repair docking to relief escorts, and enters co-sponsorship of anti-predation review statutes effective immediately. Any delegation still calling this a bilateral trade dispute is either misinformed or complicit. No one in the chamber mistook the sentence as metaphor. Hayes followed with a shorter statement that landed harder for its restraint. Humanity is opening mirrored access to all evidence repositories, including adverse material affecting our own decisions. Transparency is not a slogan today. It is a weapon against recurrence. Review us with the same standard. That final line shifted more votes than threats could have. Delegations that feared exchanging one hegemon for another saw the concession for what it was: confidence backed by record exposure. Within an hour, 3 neutral blocs petitioned to join the injunction coalition. One had received Krellick's debt relief offers that morning. Fletcher exhaled, as if he had been holding breath for years. Their immunity was procedural obscurity. You just lit it from every angle. Hayes did not let herself look relieved. Keep going. If we celebrate early, they will bury us in appeal volume. Petrov's fingers moved over her console. Sequence 3 on your mark. Beneficial owners and chamber offices, private militias attached. Mark. When Sequence 3 published, 2 senators requested emergency recess and were denied. Their aides attempted data purges from private pads and found Senate archive locks already in place under anti-tamper authority, triggered by active war-adjacent proceedings. One delegate from a border trade collective stood, announced withdrawal from all league credit instruments, and fainted before finishing the sentence. Medical teams carried them out. The vote board updated while they were still in transit. It should have looked like chaos. Instead, it looked like architecture coming down in planned stages. The first surprise for the galaxy was that humanity had prepared to fight a creditor empire on the terrain that empire trusted most. The second surprise was tempo. Krellick's campaigns depended on a long middle phase where targets doubted themselves, negotiated against their own survival, and bled quietly while legal teams argued over definitions. Human teams denied that middle phase entirely. Every seizure at ILEX fed admissible evidence to court nodes. Every court ruling fed port denials and insurance collapses. Every denial constrained Krellick's fleet movement before main battle lines even formed. By the time Blake transmitted his first punitive order packet to outer task groups, half his captains were asking whether refuel nodes would honor vouchers by the time they arrived. On Ledger of Dawn, he convened emergency command with military chiefs and market directors on one encrypted channel, a pairing that had always functioned as a single brain. Now it argued with itself. Archon Rel, director of liquidity assurance, projected shrinking credit corridors and spoke in clipped panic. If we continue high-visibility military operations while injunctions stand, collateral confidence falls below survivability thresholds. We need immediate de-escalation language, perhaps a temporary humanitarian carve-out to reopen neutral underwriting. Admiral Custodian Tarek slammed a clawed hand against the rail. De-escalation invites defections. We punish one human world publicly, confidence returns. Rel turned toward him with overt contempt. With what insured hulls and at which funded range? Valor does not settle invoices. Blake cut across both. Enough. The species in this chamber learned fear through consequence. They will relearn it. Rel did something very few Krellicks had ever done in his presence. He challenged the premise directly. High Commander, consequence is what we are receiving. For a moment, no one moved. Varesh watched Blake's posture and understood the old equilibrium had ended. The League had survived previous shocks because market and military wings wanted the same thing at the same time. Now one side needed immediate stabilizing concessions, and the other demanded exemplary violence. Either choice would break half the system. Blake dismissed the channel and ordered private consultation with Varesh alone. When the door sealed, the High Commander removed his mirrored eye membranes and set them on the console with deliberate care, exposing scarred lids and a gaze colder than the polished mask had suggested. You think I misread them? Varesh chose precision over flattery. I think we misread what they were preparing while we were pricing their desperation. Blake paced once along the balcony and looked down at Ilex telemetry where disabled Krellix frigates still drifted under human rescue operations. Human tugs had attached to League hulls whose captains had sworn to auction human medics an hour earlier. The optics were strategically lethal. They are staging virtue, Blake said. Varesh watched a feed where a human rescue team transferred an injured Krellix technician into Meridian's surgical bay without comment. Perhaps it is still working. Blake turned sharply. You sound ready to negotiate. I sound ready to preserve what can still be preserved. Outside their private channel, fresh alerts stacked. 2 client worlds formally suspended debt remittance pending Senate fraud review. A third requested human convoy protection under emergency covenant. A fourth, long considered permanently compliant, broadcast archived League requisition orders showing engineered food shortages during prior labor disputes. The release had come from inside Krellix systems. Varesh saw it first. Leak source is internal treasury cluster. Someone in our own audit branch is trading immunity for testimony. Blake's expression did not change, but the ridge along his jaw tightened. Betrayal in Krellix command culture was expected from debtors and enemies. It was not expected from accountants. He opened General Command and spoke to fleet groups still awaiting punitive vectors. His voice had regained ceremonial force. League captains. This turbulence is temporary and manufactured by coordinated fraud from a younger species unfit for strategic burden. Maintain formation discipline. Suspend non-essential port calls. Consolidate at protected exchanges. Any officer disseminating panic metrics will be removed for dereliction. We are not contracting. We are concentrating. The order bought him obedience, not confidence. Varesh watched confirmations arrive with longer and longer delays as captains checked fuel states before acknowledging. In the Senate chamber, Hayes received partial transcripts of Blake's regroup order and handed them to Sullivan. He is pulling to protected exchanges. He will try to rebuild control around static assets he can shield with civilian infrastructure. Sullivan studied the map and nodded. Treasury ring. Maybe 2 secondary nodes, but ring is the center. Petrov added, if he concentrates there, he is giving us a single legal and tactical theater. Hard fight, clean jurisdiction. Fletcher folded his hands behind his back, weary and grimly satisfied. They built their empire by dispersing liability. He's about to centralize it for us. Hayes looked up toward the chamber tiers where delegations were still reading disclosures that would reshape their politics for years. Then we force him to choose in full view, withdraw and submit to court, or entrench and become the case. At Ilex, Novak closed the last rescue report, confirmed all surviving Krellix personnel were transferred to neutral medical custody, and turned her destroyers toward the outbound corridor. Behind her, Meridian resumed course, bruised but intact, transponder still broadcasting hospital priority on open channels. Ahead of her, fleet markers multiplied as Condition Argent spread across human space and allied routes, disciplined and unspectacular, like engineers arriving at a failing dam with the blueprints already memorized. The tide had not yet broken into open victory. It had shifted, unmistakably, from human endurance to human initiative. On every Krellix board that mattered, assumptions were no longer assets. They were liabilities coming due. On every Krelix board that mattered, assumptions were no longer assets. They were liabilities coming due, and humanity's next move ensured the bill arrived faster than any League model could refinance. In Human Fleet Logistics Command, Ingrid Larson stood before a projection of the Belt of Nerith, an unremarkable debris field in Senate registries, and, until that hour, a place most analysts treated as navigational inconvenience. She keyed release authority with 2 witnesses present, and dormant transponders lit across the belt in disciplined sequence. Hull signatures rose from the static like constellations assembling themselves. Modular yards unfolded from disguised ore processors. Dry dock pedals opened. Pre-built escort frames, stacked in vacuum cradles for years under civilian industrial cover, rotated into launch position. Tugs pushed them clear while autonomous teams mounted weapons pods, medbays, and rescue grapples according to corridor need. Nothing about it was theatrical. It was procurement discipline weaponized by patience. Petrov watched the stream from Annex 3 and murmured, "They indexed us as tactically emotional and economically thin. They never audited construction permits older than 10 years. Larson did not look up. They audited permits. They never audited intent. Within 14 minutes, the first wave left Nerith under relief escort colors, not battle pennants. Within 20, 2 more hidden yards in the Caligo scrap march and the Helion-Grave orbit repeated the sequence. Human ship count in contested lanes did not double. It tripled. And because the frames were modular, each new hull could reconfigure between interdiction, convoy defense, medical evacuation, and electronic warfare in under an hour. At Krelix Port Authority Delta Voss, Compliance Director Sarek watched the new traffic bloom across public feeds and felt an old certainty fracture. The League had tolerated rumors of human reserve capacity, but rumors had belonged to political theater. This was tonnage with timestamps. He opened a priority channel to Varesh. Executor, neutral corridor density is surging with human auxiliaries. Their manifests are lawful and cross-certified by Valari clerks and Pax insurers. We can challenge individual filings. We cannot challenge all of them before transit windows close. Varesh answered from Ledger of Dawn, voice clipped and tired. Issue delay notices. We did. They rerouted through debris lanes and posted bonded transparency packets preemptively. Every challenge we file now generates damages risk under emergency covenant review. A long silence followed. Then Varesh asked the question Krelix Command had mocked for 3 days. How many hulls? Sarek swallowed. We no longer trust our estimate. By the 3rd hour after ILEX, independent Senate traffic boards showed the strategic consequence in plain numbers. Human escorted relief capacity had exceeded pre-crisis baseline by 58% despite active interdiction attempts. Worlds that should have tipped into ration panic stabilized instead. Black market premiums dropped. Insurance volatility, the League's favorite pressure tool, flattened in lanes with human escort guarantees. In the chamber, delegates who had abstained for safety now stared at route maps with open unease. The concern was no longer whether humanity could resist a creditor empire. The concern was what kind of power could build this much depth in secret while still appearing procedurally deferential in public. Speaker Elir requested verification from Senate traffic auditors. The answer came from a cautious official who had spent 20 years avoiding declarative statements. Confirmed. Human logistics expansion is real, distributed, and legally compliant. We detect no fraudulent registry inflation. Additional note: several hull classes match civilian freighter architecture retrofitted to treaty-allowed defensive standards. They are not violating armament caps. They are exploiting every clause we wrote and never expected anyone to optimize. Hayes stood at her station, listening to fear reframe itself as respect in real time. She opened a channel to Sullivan and Larson. Status, Larson answered first. Priority worlds are fed through next cycle with margin. Hospital corridors are stable. We can sustain this tempo for weeks if fuel nodes hold. Sullivan added, fuel nodes will hold. Valari, Lum, and 2 neutral blocks have open protected refuel under joint oversight. Hayes allowed one thin breath. Then publish convoy transparency to public archive. Every crate, every route, every escort assignment. If they accuse us of militarizing aid, let them do it against full daylight. The transparency release landed like a second strike. Human manifests included destination clinics, reactor maintenance kits, grain concentrates, and anti-radiation supplies, all cross-stamped by multi-species monitors. Even Krellix-aligned commentators struggled to call the operation imperial when the receiving worlds included species that had voted against humanity 2 sessions earlier. Blake tried anyway. He seized a Senate broadcast slot and delivered a declaration that began as contempt and ended as strain. Observe the primitive genius of pack behavior masquerading as policy. Humans flood lanes with improvised holes and sentimental cargo while claiming legal purity. Yet this is coercion by congestion, a swarm tactic from a labor culture that cannot comprehend disciplined hierarchy. They seek to bankrupt legitimate enforcement through volume, to replace civilized arbitration with emotional spectacle, and to force the Senate into dependence on their unmanaged abundance. If you submit now, you exchange market order for mob logistics. He might have held the room a week earlier. Now, delegates watched live feeds of pediatric wards receiving power stabilizers and orbital farms receiving nutrient shipments that should not have arrived under League toll pressure. His rhetoric collided with observable reality and lost. Hayes requested immediate response and spoke in the same low register she had maintained since the first insult. You are mistaking service for coercion because your model assumes every action seeks ownership. We are keeping people alive in lanes you tried to weaponize. Our manifests are public, our escorts are logged, and our courts are open to review. If you want market order, begin by ceasing predation. Withdraw seizure fleets and submit command records for audit. Until then, transit remains protected. The line did not sound triumphant. It sounded administrative, which unsettled the chamber more. Human resolve hardened, not in speeches but in shifts. On Kepler's mid-deck, exhausted engineers rotated from weapons calibration to pump maintenance for captured Krellix life support units because doctrine required enemy survivors delivered alive for trial. On Meridian, medical teams treated rescued League technicians beside liberated debt prisoners whose biometric tags still carried old ownership codes. No one on human decks pretended empathy erased anger. They treated anyway. Novak moved through the triage corridor with her helmet clipped at her belt, reading status tablets and signing transfer approvals. A Krellix technician, one arm in a regeneration brace, stared at her with bewildered hostility. You disabled us to prove a legal argument, he said through translator static. Now you spend medicine on us. Is this strategy or vanity? Novak paused, considering the question, as if it deserved an honest answer. It is policy. You are not a target anymore. You are evidence, and you are a person under custody. Both matter. He looked away first. 2 decks above, a young human communications specialist asked an older Valari liaison why Valari escorts had accepted such financial risk so quickly. The liaison touched the edge of their data slate, a gesture that in their culture marked old debt acknowledged. Because your species paid ours in advance generations ago, they said. Not in credits, in conduct. You defended our migration convoys when it was unprofitable and politically costly. We told ourselves gratitude was ceremonial. Today it became arithmetic. The specialist nodded once and returned to work, hands steadier than before. Sullivan addressed fleet and convoy commanders 6 hours into condition argent. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. For clarity across all channels, our objective remains unchanged. We protect civilian transit, preserve admissible record, and degrade only hostile capacity actively used for unlawful seizure. We do not punish populations for command crimes. We do not strike habitats to accelerate headlines. This will take longer than rage prefers. Hold discipline anyway. He paused as new icons populated behind him on every bridge display. Allied escorts from Valari, Compact Space, independent repair tenders from Lum, and even 2 cautious patrol groups from states that had abstained that morning. We are no longer alone on paper, Sullivan continued. Act like the guarantor we claim to be. The response packets came back with terse confirmations from dozens of captains. One appended line from a civilian auxiliary master spread quietly through human channels and became a kind of unofficial motto for the day. Steady is fast when the job is civilization. Fear on the Krellick side matured from disbelief into operational dread when their own captains began requesting humanitarian carve-outs, not for enemies, but for themselves. Without trusted neutral docks and with insurers suspending combat risk coverage, damaged League ships had fewer places to repair than their opponents, and every denied berth advertised weakness to client worlds watching for an exit. At Treasury Ring Outer Control, Quartermaster Hesh filed emergency requisitions for spare shield coils and received conditional approval tied to escrow accounts already frozen under Petrov's injunction chains. He escalated to military override and discovered military override depended on the same escrow architecture. He sent a private message to Varesh that used the most dangerous word in Krellick's bureaucracy: unsustainable. Varesh forwarded the message to Blake with no commentary. Minutes later, he was summoned to the command vault where Blake and a handful of inner circle officers stood around a tactical sphere, showing one bright truth. Scattered control was gone. Only concentration remained. Blake spoke first, ceremonial cadence restored by force of will. The League was not built by conceding initiative to frightened debtors. Treasury Ring remains fortified, supplied, and politically central. If we hold it, this panic cycle breaks. If we abandon it, every client world revolts by dawn. Admiral Custodian Tarek bared his teeth in assent. Then we hold and draw them into station shields. Humans still fear collateral optics. Varesh answered before caution could stop him. They evacuated civilians at Ilex under fire in 11 seconds. They do not fear optics. They manage them. Blake's gaze fixed on him. Say your recommendation. Immediate Senate-facing de-escalation language, Varesh said. Suspend private seizure doctrine, release bonded labor registries voluntarily, and seek monitored withdrawal terms before encirclement hardens, Tarek hissed. Capitulation. Survival, Varesh replied, with a chance to preserve civilians. Blake turned away from both and keyed fleet-wide concentration orders. Carriers, customs flotillas, and surviving enforcement escorts were to regroup at Treasury Ring under Emergency Defense Charter, civilian station shields integrated into layered battle geometry. Private Jump Gate Aperture 7 would remain on standby for command continuity transfer if required. The order solved one problem and created another. It gave humanity a single theater where military necessity, legal jurisdiction, and political visibility converged. It also told every neutral observer where the final ledger would close. Hayes received the concentration intercept while standing on the Senate floor between two delegations that had spent years avoiding eye contact with human diplomats. Now, both waited for her reaction before speaking. She opened a secure channel to Sullivan, Petrov, Fletcher, Larson, and Novak. Faces appeared in sequence, weary and focused. "He is massing at Treasury Ring," Hayes said. "Civilian shields integrated, private jump gate armed." Petrov replied at once. "We can blind their fire control again, but ring architecture is denser. We need pre-evacuation pathways, or we lose the moral frame." Larson added, "Relief tonnage can carry evac pods if we strip non-critical cargo from secondary corridors. It hurts, but it is feasible." Fletcher tapped his screen. "Legal authority is cleaner than any theater we have had. Active seizure command, documented fraud chain, and now concentration inside common financial infrastructure. If we issue final notice and they refuse, jurisdiction is explicit." Sullivan looked toward Novak's feed, where her task group was rearming beside a convoy that had not missed schedule once. "Can your crews do this without habitat breach?" Novak's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, but only if we control timing from first second." Hayes nodded once. "Then, timing is ours. Draft final warning. Full Senate transmission, all public archives mirrored." In the chamber, delegates sensed the turn before the words arrived. The balance had shifted from resistance to enforcement. Humanity was no longer asking whether the League would obey covenant limits. Humanity was setting the conditions under which the League would face judgment. Hayes took the floor and delivered the notice that closed the middle phase of the war. "Attention all League command elements and affiliated enforcement fleets. You are ordered to withdraw from Treasury Ring civilian sectors, power down seizure systems, and submit command logs to Senate tribunal custody. You have one compliance window. If you refuse, coalition forces will disable your capacity to continue hostilities, preserve civilian infrastructure, and take command personnel into custody for trial. This is the final warning." She ended transmission and stepped back from the dais. Around her, the chamber held a silence no broker could buy. At Treasury Ring, Blake listened to the warning under cold vault lights, then gave the only answer his system could still produce. Battle stations. Human and allied vectors bent toward the ring like converging lines in an equation that had finally lost its unknowns. Human and allied vectors bent toward the ring like converging lines in an equation that had finally lost its unknowns, and Admiral Marcus Sullivan watched those lines settle into firing geometry, while the Treasury Ring swelled across the bridge display in layered arcs of steel, commerce, and hostage logic. Civilian habitats rotated around the exchange spine in 3 luminous bands, each one threaded through defense lattices Blake had fused to military control loops. The Krelix assumption was blunt. Humans would not risk the political cost of striking through living infrastructure. Sullivan keyed Open Fleet Command and gave the order that made that assumption obsolete. Operation Lantern is active. Priority 1 is civilian extraction. Priority 2 is shield decoupling. Priority 3 is command incapacitation. Confirm no habitat kill trajectories in any battery solution. We are ending this tonight, and we are ending it on record. Acknowledgements flashed from destroyer squadrons, Volari escort wings, LUM repair tenders converted to evacuation carriers, and civilian auxiliaries that had spent the day hauling grain and were now carrying pod cradles. On a parallel channel, Anna Petrov's cyber teams announced insertion windows into ring traffic control, their packets already piggybacking on routine docking telemetry. Thomas Fletcher uploaded emergency writs to Senate archive mirrors and tagged every anticipated strike with legal predicates before a single weapon discharged. Hayes stood at the Senate dais, feeding live authority codes into the chain as if she were signing treaty clauses instead of battle gates. At Treasury Ring Command, Blake received the incoming formation map and spoke to his staff with ceremonial contempt that no longer fully concealed strain. Children arrive in crowds when they require courage by arithmetic. Hold civilian shields. Force them to fire first on their own moral claims. All batteries. Target-led human carriers and allied refuel hulls. Break their logistics spine. And this performance ends. Executor Varesh watched the same map and saw what Blake refused to name. Human vectors were not charging the strongest sector. They were approaching every docking collar, freight spindle, and maintenance throat with synchronized precision, each approach lane paired with evacuation craft and signal repeaters. This was not rage. It was choreography. 90 seconds later, Petrov's intrusion package reached Treasury Ring docking control and rewrote evacuation priority tables in one sweep. Habitat sectors C through H received compulsory emergency undock orders under Senate Emergency Authority Override codes pre-validated by Fletcher and Hayes and mirrored in public archives, keyed to reactor contamination risk. Civilian tugs shoved passenger clusters toward open corridors where human and Valeri escorts were waiting with transponder beacons set to Senate emergency frequencies. Blake realized the maneuver as the first station quarter peeled away from his defensive overlap. "Countermand and lock collars," he snapped. "Locks are not responding," a systems officer answered. "Control bus is accepting external arbitration signatures. We cannot authenticate route." Sullivan watched civilian mass readings drop from the threatened sectors and counted silently. At 11 seconds, the extraction threshold crossed minimum viability. He did not wait for a cleaner number. Lantern Phase 2. Blind their gunnery. Human cyber pulses hit first, not as cinematic bursts, but as disciplined interruptions in timing integrity. Krellick's fire control began chasing phantom vectors that existed a fraction of a second off reality, enough to drag heavy batteries out of solution. Drone clouds followed from modular pods hidden inside what had registered as relief cargo. Thousands of compact units fanned across the ring's shield projector grid, stitching dazzlers over targeting apertures and burning control relays with pinpoint thermal spikes that left core systems intact and habitats powered. Then, kinetic lances spoke from standoff range, each shot mapped to sever weapon spines, drive veins, and command uplinks while skirting habitation rings by meters. The first Krellick's carrier rolled under the impact, propulsion cones dark, broadside arrays dead. A second tried to pivot into the civilian band and found its shield harmonics collapsing, where drone teams had already cut projector nodes from the network. Valari frigates threaded through the gap, launching rescue pods and decoy buoys in the same pass. Lum tenders, painted in rescue white that no one mistook for weakness anymore, took station behind human destroyers and began pulling venting crews from disabled League escorts. Blake ordered concentrated fire on the human flagship line. Half his batteries fired into false telemetry. The rest found their targeting uplink severed mid-volley when Petrov's teams pushed a second wave through maintenance backdoors, seeded during years of licensed software exchanges Krellick's auditors had dismissed as beneath strategic concern. On Sullivan's board, hostile accuracy dropped from lethal to erratic in under 30 seconds. "Maintain discipline," Sullivan said. "No pursuit into habitat shadows. Disable and pass." Captain Sophia Novak acknowledged from the boarding corvette Kestrel, her voice steady over a background of clipped impact reports. "Kestrel Group has Corridor Blue. 2 Krellick's destroyers are drifting toward civilian Ring 3. We are cutting thrust now." Her gunners fired 3-shot rails that punched through maneuver housings without breaching living decks. The destroyers slewed harmlessly away from the habitat arc. Novak did not watch them drift. Her feed had already shifted to the private jump gate aperture 7 flaring behind the Treasury Exchange, exactly where Fletcher had predicted command continuity would run when collapse became undeniable. On Ledger of Dawn, Varesh saw the aperture bloom and understood Blake had chosen survival of command over survival of narrative. Gate window is unstable under combat interference, Banka, he warned. We need full escort screen or we lose the transit. Blake bared his teeth. Then hold the window. I will not be displayed in chains for Senate amusement. He moved toward the transfer lift as the bridge shuddered under another precision strike. Across external feeds, human corvettes were already burning hard for Aperture 7, their vectors too clean to be improvisation. Sullivan had anticipated the retreat. Novak, Sullivan said, Aperture 7 is your theater. Collapse it on my mark. Blake does not leave this jurisdiction. Understood, Novak replied. Gravitic Mind Flight is armed. Waiting mark. Hayes's voice entered command net from the Senate floor, calm enough to slow pulse rates. All channels. Senate archive confirms civilian evacuation exceeds mandated threshold. Jurisdiction remains active. Proceed. Sullivan gave the mark. 3 human corvettes released synchronized gravitic mines into the aperture's edge geometry. The devices did not explode in flame. They folded local curvature into a tight shear that warped the gate throat out of phase. The jump window imploded with a silent snap across tactical screens, and the League escort wing assigned to screen Blake's exit lost formation as space-time stress kicked them broadside. Kestrel and 2 Marine cutters cut through the debris wake and latched onto Ledger of Dawn's flank with magnetic clamps biting through scorched armor. Boarding was fast, violent, and controlled. Human Marines moved by compartment map. Pulse carbines on non-lethal settings unless fired upon with heavy weapons. They sealed blast doors, vented weapon lockers, and rerouted life support around burning conduits, while combat engineers patched pressure leaks that threatened both crews. Krellick's resistance broke in pockets as command circuits died and surrender advisories began broadcasting from ships Blake could no longer reach. By the 12th minute of close action, Treasury Ring's military grid was combat ineffective. Surviving League hulls were disabled, disarmed, or transmitting surrender codes. Civilian sections remained pressurized. Station lights stayed on. Across the Senate chamber, delegates watched live as the architecture Blake had used as a shield became the architecture that preserved witnesses. Novak reached Ledger of Dawn's bridge access with her first team and breached on synchronized charges set to peel locks without hole puncture. Smoke and failing consoles filled the command deck in amber pulses. High Commander Blake stood near the central rail in scorched armor, one shoulder plate split, one upper hand braced against a dead display. Around him, his bridge officers were either down, disarmed, or kneeling with restraint loops already cinched by Marines. He looked at Novak as if meeting an accounting error that should not exist. I am the market's will, he said, voice rough but carrying. You cannot arrest gravity. Novak stepped through drifting sparks, helmet under one arm, sidearm low and steady. For 30 years, we were courteous. We hoped you would choose restraint. You chose predation. Blake's lower hand moved to a ceremonial sidearm mounted at his belt. 2 Marines shouted warnings. He drew and fired once. The shot scorched a console beside Novak and vanished into dead circuitry. Novak answered with a single, non-lethal pulse from her sidearm that hit center mass and dropped him hard without penetrating armor. He convulsed, conscious, gasping, weapon skittering across the deck. Target subdued, Novak said into command net. High Commander Blake is alive and restrained. She crossed the deck, knelt long enough to secure his wrists with a magnetic bind, and checked his vitals with a medic scanner clipped from her vest. Stable, furious, alive enough to stand trial. Blake forced his eyes open as Marines hauled him upright. "You think this is victory," he hissed. "Remove one league and 10 markets will replace it. Predation is the native law." Novak held his gaze. "No. Predation is a choice systems permit. We are changing the system." Outside the bridge, surrender signals propagated in widening circles. Varesh, taken in an adjacent command alcove, met Novak's eyes once and gave a terse nod that might have been relief or exhaustion. He ordered remaining loyal units to stand down on all channels, then repeated the order in old Krellick's command cant, so no captain could claim translation ambiguity. The last meaningful pockets of resistance ended within minutes. Sullivan came on a secure line as Novak escorted Blake through the carrier's central corridor toward transfer docking. "Status confirmation." "Ledger of Dawn secured," Novak said. "Blake in custody, conscious, restraints verified. Varesh and bridge staff detained. No civilian habitat failures in our sector." "Copy all," Sullivan answered. A beat later he added, "Quieter." "Well executed, Captain." At Treasury Ring Central Concourse, under emergency lights and live Senate transmission, a temporary tribunal intake point was assembled from modular legal stations and military custody rails. Fletcher stood with multi-species clerks to witness chain of custody. Hayes remained visible on the chamber feed, expression hard and composed, as Blake was brought in under guard. Cameras recorded every angle. No hidden transfer. No private settlement. Fletcher read the charges in full. Unlawful seizure warfare, fraud conspiracy across Senate jurisdictions, command responsibility for coercive debt bondage, and armed aggression in common space. Blake listened with blood on his lip and contempt still burning behind his eyes, then looked toward the nearest broadcast lens as if searching for leverage in spectacle. "You have guns and clerks," he said. "You have not disproved me. You have merely interrupted me." Hayes answered from the Senate dais. Her words routed into the intake hall for record. Interruption was the emergency measure. Judgment is the durable one. Fletcher presented the surrender instrument, a plain document compared with the ornate contracts that had built the League. "State your name and authority for the record. Confirm status of command." Blake stayed silent long enough for the hall to hear life support fans and distant repair drones outside. Then he exhaled through clenched teeth. "I am Blake of the Krellick's League," he said, each word forced flat. "I yield all military authority and submit to judgment." Fletcher countersigned. Novak signed as arresting officer. A Valari observer and alum magistrate added witness seals. Chain complete. As Blake was transferred to Tribunal 1 custody, Senate boards updated across known space. League Fleet Combat Command neutralized. Treasury Ring secured. Private seizure doctrine suspended by emergency supermajority pending permanent ban. On Kepler, on Meridian, in relief ports that had expected famine and found escorts instead, crews kept working through the night shift because victory had generated a second task list. Stabilize, document, rebuild. Sullivan remained on his bridge until the final hostile battery at the ring powered down under monitored control. Only then did he remove his headset and look at the tactical map now crowded with green rescue routes where red interdiction lines had been. Hayes's final transmission to Fleet and Senate ran without flourish. Threat capability is ended. Civilian protection remains in effect. Justice proceeds at tribunal pace, not combat pace. Hold your stations and finish the work. No one on human channels celebrated loudly. They logged, repaired, testified, and escorted the next convoy out on schedule. No one on human channels celebrated loudly. They logged, repaired, testified, and escorted the next convoy out on schedule. In Treasury Ring Medical Concourse 2, The smell of coolant and antiseptic replaced the sharp ozone of battle, and human corpsmen worked down a triage line that did not sort by species. Krellick's crew, with burns from control room fires, lay beside liberated debt prisoners whose ownership implants were being removed one at a time under Senate observer cameras. A human Marine from Kestrel stood rigid at the intake rail, jaw tight as a medic asked him to carry plasma packs to a Krellick's patient who had boarded Meridian hours earlier. He tried to auction a hospital, the Marine said. The medic did not slow her hands. Now he is a patient under custody. Move. He moved. Not gracefully, but immediately. Captain Sophia Novak crossed the ward with a slate full of custody signatures and paused at Bay 7, where High Commander Blake sat, restrained to a reinforced chair, while surgeons sealed the neural stun burns along his thorax. He glared at her as if pain itself were an argument. "You keep us alive to display us," he said. Novak checked the monitor, confirmed stable rhythm, and signed the treatment continuation order. "We keep you alive because tribunal requires a living defendant and because we are not what you said we were." By dawn cycle, inventory officers had converted a freight haul into evidence intake. Every physical item tied to the campaign passed under multi-species scan arches with chain tags visible to press pools. Blake's ceremonial sidearm, recovered on ledger of Dawn's Bridge, was logged as Exhibit 44. Residue matched to the shot that scorched Novak's console. Boarding teams submitted cracked command cores, targeting logs, and the mirrored ocular membranes Blake had removed before the battle. Those were marked non-evidentiary personal effects and sealed for eventual prison transfer. Petrov's forensic drives containing Shell Corporation lineage went directly to Tribunal 1 vault storage under dual-key lock. The ELX rail strike telemetry that had disabled impound tugs without killing crews was admitted as proof of proportional force. Nothing disappeared into private archives. Nothing vanished in patriotic fog. 3 days later, Larson stood in fleet logistics with a problem no war college had glamorized. Krellick's civilian habitats were entering supply failure because their command economy had depended on confiscation streams now shut off by injunction and surrender. Feed pressure in 6 orbital stations had dropped below emergency baseline. A destroyer captain on Secure Channel offered a blunt solution. Let them feel consequences. They engineered hunger for others. Larson turned her display so he could read the habitat biosigns himself. Consequences are for convicted command staff. These are civilians and low-rank workers, many of whom are now testifying. We do not build anti-predation law by rehearsing predation with better branding. Hayes joined the call from Senate Annex and gave the ruling that settled the fleet debate. Record this as doctrine. Justice is mandatory. Cruelty is optional, and we decline it. Divert tonnage from non-critical military freight to Krellick civilian stabilization under monitored delivery. Every crate tracked. Every recipient list public. The order cost readiness margin. Human crews did it anyway. Volari escorts took outer lanes. LUM repair tenders converted to food distribution hubs. Former client worlds that had once feared human power now watched human carriers dock at Krellick stations with grain concentrates and reactor filters, then depart without demanding a signature on political allegiance. The galaxy understood the message because it was expensive. At Tribunal 1, Varesh's loaded silence from the battle finally broke under oath. He testified for 14 continuous hours, translating internal command cant, validating Quartermaster Hesch's unsustainable requisition report, and confirming that League famine models had been used as leverage tools in at least 9 systems. Sarek, from Delta Voss, corroborated port delay directives and beneficial owner masks. In exchange, prosecutors offered conditional amnesty to non-command personnel who provided complete records and signed renunciation of bonded labor doctrine. Thousands accepted. A smaller number refused and faced full prosecution. The distinction mattered, and Hayes insisted it be published in plain language so no species could call the process Victor's improvisation. Blake received no such offer. At sentencing, he stood behind transparent restraint fields while Fletcher read final findings from a bench composed of Human, Villari, Lum, and neutral jurists. The judgment stripped him of military authority permanently and imposed life confinement in demilitarized orbital prison Carth Vale, with communication access limited to legal counsel and monitored family channels. His inner circle received matching life terms or long custodial sentences depending on command rank. The Krelix Merchant League, as a legal entity, was dissolved on record the same day. Its seizure fleet charters were revoked, and hulls were either scrapped under inspection or repurposed to civilian freight under Senate trusteeship. 18 months after Treasury Ring, the Senate reconvened under bright white chamber bands instead of emergency amber. Hayes stood at the same dais where Blake had once called humanity adolescent, while clerks distributed the final reciprocity charter text in 74 legal languages and 3 machine-audited symbolic codes. The charter banned sapient debt bondage outright, outlawed private seizure fleets, required arbitration algorithms to be open auditable, and mandated multi-species courts with rotating technical reviewers drawn from smaller states, not just major powers. Speaker Elier called the roll. One by one, delegations cast votes that would have been unthinkable before ILEX. The Villari voted yes and formally entered the Reconstruction Compact leadership with humanity. The scholars of Lum voted yes and accepted permanent oversight of algorithmic fairness audits. The merchants of Pax voted yes after inserting transparency triggers they had once resisted. Even the reconstituted Krelix Civic Authority, led by non-combat administrators and monitored by Senate trustees, voted yes and publicly renounced reclamation doctrine as a crime architecture. When the tally locked, the charter passed by supermajority with no abstentions. Sullivan, in full dress this time, met Novak outside the chamber while press drones circled at respectful distance. He handed her a slim case. "Your bridge scar sample," he said. "Exhibit duplicate release. Tribunal closed it this morning." Inside the case sat a fused shard from the console Blake had hit with his missed shot, mounted beside a line of text from the judgment. Proportional defense verified. Civilian protection sustained. Novak closed the case and looked through the observation glass toward the central floor where former Client World delegates were signing infrastructure grants with Larson's logistics office and Villari planners. "Feels less dramatic than the battle," she said. Sullivan's mouth shifted in dry understatement. "Civilization usually does." The final operational reports arrived that evening and closed the last open threads. Petrov certified all emergency forensic repositories migrated from wartime mirrors into permanent Senate evidence vaults, with public redacted access and independent check sum verification. Fletcher filed disposition notices for every contested physical exhibit, admitted, archived, returned, or destroyed by court order. External distress calls from the opening seizures, including the Meridian auction broadcast, were marked resolved with survivor accounting complete. The loaded pauses and fearful glances that had defined the early sessions were now historical footnotes and transcript annotations. Where motives remained unknowable, the record said so without embellishment. At ILEX Hyperlane Junction, where the first impound order had triggered the war, a new transit beacon came online under charter protocols. Charter. Its control board included humans, Villari, Lum, and 2 species that had once sold abstentions to survive the week. No private guns guarded it. No hidden toll multipliers sat in shadow contracts. Convoys passed on published rates. Medical traffic retained untouchable priority, and arbitration appeals streamed to transparent courts where every species could inspect the code. Hayes visited once, without ceremony, and stood on Meridian's rebuilt observation deck as mixed escorts peeled away toward different stars. Humanity had not taken a throne. It had taken a burden. Guarantor of open transit and anti-predation law, renewed each term by vote and revoked only by the same process. That was precisely why the role held. Behind her, the junction lights cycled green across lanes that had once been red with coercion. Ahead, ships from worlds that no longer feared auction signals entered jump on schedule and kept going.